To provide a children's playground, the Lisburn Borough Council purchased land adjacent to the Lambeg Road, Station Road, which belonged to a Mr. W. Belcher, a well-known contractor. The playground was completed and officially opened in the year 1954. Until a few years ago, a high stone wall ran along the Lambeg Road where Priory Close now stands. It formed part of an uncompleted building overlooking Glenmore House. Jonathan Richardson of Lambeg House built a wall for a row of barns and sheds, but Charles Richardson required it as part of Glenmore. The case was taken to court and Jonathan won, but never did any more building and left the wall as an eyesore to aggravate Charles. Time has now accomplished what Charles' barristers could not, and the wall crumbled before the bulldozers. But its stones remain, used as a facing on the pensioners' bungalows, which still face Glenmore House. Lambeg House was built in the early 17th century. Francis Seymour, first Viscount Conmay, resided there for some years when the house was known locally as the Lord's House. In 1760 it was purchased by Mr. John Williamson, who owned practically the entire village and who played a prominent part in the development of the linen trade. The house is situated about 2 miles east of Lisburn and grounds that were between 70 or 80 acres on either side of the river and canal. It then became the property of Mr. J. Hancock, who enlarged it and carried out many improvements. The house then passed to Mr. Henry Bell, a relation of the Williamsons, before becoming the seat of Mr. Robert Williamson. It was named Glenmore House when it became the property of Mr. James Nicholson Richardson. Glenmore House, the original Lambeg House, was in the Richardson family until about 1901, when it became the property of Mr. John M. Milligan. In 1919, the premises were sold to the Linen Industry Research Association. In that year, Glenmore House, now standing at some 22 acres of land, was taken over for conversion into the Linen Research Institute, where investigations relating to all branches of the linen trade, from flax culture to the final process of bleaching and finishing, were carried out. Sadly, in the year 1989, portions of the estate were sold for the building of private housing. Lambeg House was built in the year 1785. At the beginning of the 19th century, a separate residence was added, one house being occupied by Mr. David Barclay and the other by Mrs. Mariam, sister of the Rev. Dickinson. Mr. Barclay was at one time the owner of the Lambeg Bleach Works. In about 1847, the property passed into the hands of another extensive bleacher, Mr. Jonathan Richardson. The house was known as the Lambeg Village House, or the Chains. Sadly, the house was destroyed by a terrorist bomb in 1972. In the ruins of the house, Coca-Cola, the present site owners, built a memorial park in 1986 for the use of the people in the village. As far back as the year 1626, a bleach green was established in Lambeg. In the 1700s it became the property of Mr. John Williamson. In 1736 the concern passed into the hands of Mr. David Barclay, and later still it became the property of Mr. Jonathan Richardson, and was succeeded by his sons John and Alexander. In about 1896 it came into the hands of Mr. John Milligan. In 1911 it came under the control of Mr. W.R. McMurray, there being about 150 people employed. The green closed in 1964 and was taken over by the Coca-Cola company. What is now an antique shop was once owned by the Lambeg Bleach Green, and as stated by Bertie Bruce, the workers had to buy their food, clothes, coal, etc. from the mill shop, paying for them with tokens they received as part of their wages. In later years the shop was opened as the Priory Stores by Mr. Kerr Hearn. The shop passed into the hands of his son Mr. Dan Hearn and finally closed in the 1980s. These houses at Green Hill, together with the houses at Green Lane, and along with the houses at Railway View and Station Road, were built for the benefit of the workers in the Lambeg Green. When the Green closed, the premises were taken over by the Coca-Cola Bottlers Limited in 1967. The company itself had opened in Belfast in 1939. Its Golden Jubilee was celebrated in 1989. In addition to a school at Ballisgay, there was also a school at Tullinacross, known locally as Lambeg School. This building was demolished and rebuilt in 1849. It is now used as an extension of the Lambeg Church. Derrygolgy Manor Courthouse was built in the year 1837 by the Marquess of Hereford. The court met every third Monday, and the recovery of debts under £20 was decided, while all disputes, arisings, etc. were decided at Lisbon Petty Sessions. The present owner is Mr. Bob Stewart. Lambeg House, formerly known as Lambeg Cottage, it was erected early in the 19th century by Mr. Henry Bell, linen merchant, and was later still enlarged by him. It then passed into the hands of Mrs. McNeill Hamilton and was later occupied by the Reverend Edward Leslie, treasurer of Dromore. Later still it was purchased by Mr. Josie Richardson, and after a time became the property of his sister Mrs. Clibborn, who in turn bequeathed it to her cousin Mr. Alex Earth Richardson, who resided from 1880 till his death in 1919. The estate was then purchased by Mr. W.R. McMurray, chairman of the Lambeg Bleaching, Dyeing and Finishing Company in 1920. Units of the British Army, the Royal Engineers, followed by the Royal Artillery, took possession of the estate from 1940 to 1944. The demolition of the house was carried out in 1948. In 1984, the Lisburn Council purchased the land and transformed it into a 9-hole golf course. This was officially opened in 1986. At this spot a thatched cottage once stood, one of the last in the village. An interesting feature of the cottage was the wooden spouting. At one time it was the home of Mrs. Emery, and the only remains are the original wild roses that grew round the cottage. It was demolished in the late 1950s. This house at one time belonged to the Lambeg Green. It is now the property of Mrs. and Miss Kirkwood. Lagan Lodge is situated at the top of the church hill. It was built in about 1730 by a member of the Wolfenden family and was later the residence of the landowner, Mr. Robert Wilson. Originally there were about 13 acres of land to the property extending to the River Lagan. These are the parish houses, owned by the church and rented to the parishioners. The houses now stand vacant, the last being occupied by Miss Myrtle McVeigh until early 1991. The property is to be extensively renovated in the near future. The original Sexton's house was demolished in 1910 and replaced by the present house at a cost of £210, Mr. David McHenry of Derryockey being the contractor. At the same time, J. Millen Barber purchased land to provide a garden and erected the iron railings around the property. The present sexton is Mr. George Harum. An interesting item taken from the Select Vestry Minute Book is as follows.
That James Dixon, being dismissed from the office of sexton, in consequence of its being suspected that he aided in raising some dead bodies which were ascertained to have been carried away from the churchyard.
A number of these houses were purchased by well-known conservationist Mr. Raymond Cullen in early 1991. Near this spot once stood a suspension bridge allowing access to the Lambeg Mill. Sadly, it was removed in the year 1988. was anxious to find out when a place of worship first stood in Lambeg, but unfortunately no definite statement can be made in this connection, for all the records that deal with the subject have been lost. The earliest date we can be sure of in connection with the church is 1598. We know definitely that a church stood there, for in a collection of old maps which can be seen in the British Museum in London, there is one of Ulster which was made in that year. On this map, Lambeg Church is clearly marked. In addition to this, a tombstone was unearthed in the churchyard bearing the date 1626. The inscription reads, "Here lieth the body of Margaret Wilson, wife of Daniel Savage, who departed this life the 24th of April 1626. Dr. Francis Hutchison, Bishop of Down and Connor, has left it on record that he consecrated the church at Lambeg on September the 25th, 1737. The church was entirely rebuilt in 1849 with the exception of the tower. The tower was rebuilt in the year 1977. In former times there existed a school at Ballisgate, but this was closed when the new school was built on land owned by Mr. Jonathan Richardson adjacent to Lambeg Church in 1849. The materials for the school were obtained from the old church, which accounted for the ecclesiastical character of its windows. This school was demolished to allow for a car park to be constructed in 1947. Chromium House was built in about 1640 by the Wolfenden family on the road leading from Ballisgay to the ford below the church where now stands Wolfenden Bridge. The Wolfenden family were said to be of Dutch extraction and settled in Lambeg in 1685. They assisted in establishing the manufacture of linen in this neighbourhood at the close of the 17th or the beginning of the 18th century. Subsequently, the house passed into the hands of Mr. Richard Niven, formerly of Glasgow. Close by, Mr. Niven established the works for printing of muslin, in which he first applied with success his invention of bichrome, from which he named his residence. In the grounds, not a twisted beech trees exist. The branches are said to have been interwoven by the Reverend John Wesley as a sign of church unity. Colehill was purchased by Mr. John M. Milligan in about 1898 and was occupied by him until about 1901, when it was rented to Major Jenkins. In 1905 it became the property of Mr. B. Hobson and a Mr. F. C. Barrett in 1921. In 1924 it was purchased by Mrs. Downer. It is now the property of a well-known architect, Mr. Rob McKinstry.
Amen.